Welcome to Hand of the Day, a new video series where I review a hand that I posted on my Discord. Each video is going to be a deep dive into one specific hand, and you'll learn tons of valuable tips and insights. Our analysis is going to be incredibly quick and incredibly practical because it's rooted in a hand. At Savant, we're all about efficiency. So let's get right into our very first one. In this specific spot, we're looking at a blind versus blind situation. Hero is small blind playing against big blind, who is an aggressive regular. This is somewhere at lower stakes, so just around 50 NL, and the note that we have on the player is that they are an aggressive reg with a positive red line and a negative blue line. They bluff a lot and value bet very thin. Hero is holding 8-7 of clubs and decides to check on the flop, which is monotone 10-7 deuce. Big blind checks, and the turn is the ace of hearts. Hero decides to check again, and this time faces a bet from big blind. They call the small bet and head over to the river. On the Queen of Diamonds river, Hero decides to check, big blind decides to go for 75% pot, and now we're not sure what Hero should do. I asked this question to my Discord community, and I got a few mixed responses. Most people voted to fold, but a surprising number of people decided to either call or raise, with raise being a little bit more popular. Now, before we dive into some detailed strategy, I want to read out a few of the community answers that justified people's votes. The first one comes from Pal, who was one of the few people who voted to call. Pal writes, "I think villain is very polarized to flushes or air here, and if that's the case, we just need to ask if we're getting direct odds to bluff catch. Or in other words, does villain bluff more than 30% of the time here? I think the answer is clearly yes, it's an aggressive player, and therefore I would call with 8-7 or any king high." One thing I really like about this answer is that they're making their decision based on the player type, which is going to have a very big impact in a number of spots. This answer is in line with what data analysis shows. According to analysis derived from millions of hands played from low to high stakes, data indicates that bluff catching against this line in this specific spot is going to be quite favorable, and it will only be better against an aggressive opponent. Texture doesn't tend to matter too much in this spot. The fact that the board is monotone and has a lot of Broadway cards makes bluff catching here a tiny bit worse, but it's still going to be favorable simply according to data. But bluff catching isn't going to be the only option that we have in this spot. We also have a raise option. In a few separate answers, Nara writes, "We definitely can make him fold better hands by check raising here. If we check raise, our opponent would consider folding these low or medium flushes." Whenever you're playing against an aggressive opponent, one big thing you always want to ask yourself is, will raising be okay here? I think there's definitely two types of aggressive players. Those that will just bet with a lot of air and then throw it away against a raise, and maybe the other type, which is just going to be aggressive overall, both in terms of bluffing and bluff catching. I didn't really specify which one of those two player types we happen to be up against in this hand, but if you just take a step back and you look at the research, it again does indicate that most player types will tremendously overfold against a river raise. When you compare both of these options on paper, raising happens to be the higher EV option. People generally do not like bluff catching against river raises. If we decide to call with 8-7, then we're definitely beating our opponent because they have too many bluffs here, but if we raise against them, they will fold those bluffs and likely fold a lot of those weaker to medium flushes that Nara pointed out. So I really like this point, and I definitely agree with it. And there's one more point that I really love from the discussion, but you guys are going to have to wait until the end of the video to find out what it is. But for now, let's head over to Savant to get some more practical insights by taking a much closer look at this spot. We're going to walk through this hand as if it were one of the annotated solutions over at the website, but the annotations are going to be much smaller here since you also have me talking. So the first point that I want to make actually has to do with the flop c-bet strategy. In this spot, small blind elected to check, which is definitely fine with a hand like 8-7, but it's also very much worth noting that solver does actually like to bet with a decent chunk of its range. A lot of people will see this monotone flop and just elect to range check, which isn't necessarily the best option. As it turns out, going for a small bet on the flop, a small bet on the turn, and then a big bet on the river happens to be the superior bluffing line in this situation. And so if you're one of those players that decides to range check on this monotone flop, you are missing out on an amazing bluffing exploit. But of course, if you're just not comfortable with playing a mixed c-bet strategy on the flop, range checking can definitely be a decent idea. It keeps the strategy simple, but it does have that really big drawback. The next point worth discussing concerns how big blind played after we decided to check on the flop. The note here says most regs check back too often on monotone flops, but will bet roughly at the solver frequency on the average texture. A big mistake that I catch a lot of newer players making is trying to range the opponent a little bit too extremely. A lot of times people will say something like, the opponent can never have a flush after they checked on the flop because they're going to always bet their flushes, but it's simply not true. Monotone boards and higher boards tend to be checked fairly often in big blind's shoes, which means they'll still have plenty of strong hands after they decide to check back. Next up, let's head over to the turn play for big blind, which has a lot of important points. The note here says this player type is known to bet too thin and overbluff all over the game tree. The thin value bets in this spot will probably come from the hands like weaker flushes. You can see that most of these hands should be checking. If you take a look at the betting frequency for these hands, you'll notice there is a lot of room for this player type to overdo it. Flushes are only supposed to bet 30% of the time, but they could easily bet them 70 or 80% of the time. Now this might seem like this is a very bad factor for bluff catching from a small blind's shoes, but there are a few other factors to consider. First of all, it's the fact that their bluffs shouldn't be betting very often here either. Low pairs, king highs, and nothing hands are also only betting around 30% of the time. Although this player type will overdo it with flushes, they'll still overdo it with bluffs, according to the data. And the second thing worth noting is the opponent's bet size. The solver really prefers to use a small bet on the turn, and that's exactly what the opponent did. But it's not the only option available for players, and it's very common for players to split their turn betting range into multiple different bet sizes, maybe without even realizing it. It means when big blind is holding a strong hand, like a king high flush or a queen high flush, they're more likely to use a bigger bet size. And when they're holding a weaker flush or they're holding a bluff, they're a bit more likely to use the smaller bet size. This sort of mistake is quite common, and even if big blind thinks they're playing quite well here by using a small bet when they're holding a bluff, they might actually be making this very common mistake of splitting their range up into a bigger bet with the stronger hands and a smaller bet with the weaker hands. They'll just be a little bit more biased to betting big when they hold that strong hand. Data does indicate that smaller turn bets are much more likely to be bluffed, and so overall, this small bet is going to be very, very good to defend against. Our final step for the river play really just condenses everything that we've learned. It's easy for aggro regs to massively overbluff here, as ranges are very wide. However, the presence of multiple Broadway cards does make bluff catching a little bit worse. This is just a common data pattern that's worth remembering. When it's a higher board, it means bluff catching is going to be a bit worse, but aggro regs will overbluff on every single texture. And as I mentioned, raising is going to be far superior to calling. The idea is that if we call, we're only beating our opponent's bluffs, but if we're raising, we're getting those bluffs to fold, and we're also getting those weaker flushes to fold. The fact that their range is so skewed towards those hands after using a small turn bet is only going to make raising better. Of course, as I mentioned, you don't really want to raise here against stationy players. If you think your opponent might be taking this line with a hand like a set, and then always calling down if you raise, then raising is just going to be a bad idea. In order for raising to be the best move, you have to be fairly certain that your opponent is going to overfold with at least some decent hands like weaker flushes. And this really does tie into another point, and that is the fact that you have to be careful when it comes to river bluff raises. Earlier, I talked all about how bluff raising on rivers is going to be very good against every single player type, but it's something that has to be done in moderation. Remember that river raises only work because people perceive them to be underbluffed. You can see that 8-7 is a very low frequency raise. So if you just start implementing raises with this hand 100% of the time, maybe you start raising some 10x too, maybe you start raising more of your 7x, then you're just going to get into a situation where your raising frequency goes up to something like 30 or 40%. That's never a good idea. Players will catch on very quickly because river raises are noteworthy and rare, so it's not something you can expect to get away with if you overdo it. My recommendation is to use a randomizer in these spots and set a raising frequency for something like 15 to 20%. Alternatively, you can just feel it out, but whatever you do, make sure you don't abuse this exploit. And that is almost all I have for the video, because there is one other exploit that I want to tell you guys about, which I alluded to earlier in the video. This is from a Discord comment from the Godson, who writes, "If I did call turn, it would probably be with the intention to donk 75% pot on the river. I know the line looks goofy, but I feel that it works." Yes, it does look goofy, but yes, this also works. There is a very small donking range that occurs on this river, and it's not really important to understand the reasons why. This is something I talked about quite a lot in some of my previous videos, but river donks are absolutely fantastic for bluffing. Not only is there a big overfold against river donks, but it also prevents big blind from even making that river bet. It's clearly a tough spot to hold 8-7 of clubs and face the 75% bet on the river, but by donking, you can actually avoid that difficult situation altogether. Note that river donking isn't all that common, so just like when it comes to raises, it's best to not overdo it. Practically, I think a good strategy that crushes regs is to sometimes donk on this river and sometimes raise. By doing both, you ensure that you don't become too predictable, but you're taking full advantage of the fact that the opponent is just going to have such a weak range in the spot that will overfold against any form of aggression. With that said, I encourage you guys to follow the link down below to join our Discord to vote on hands and participate in our discussions. We do this twice a week, it's very fun, and it also gives you the chance to understand how other regs think through spots. I personally think that's very valuable because it helps you build your poker intuition. Good intuition equals good win rate. So follow the link down below, and I will see you guys in the next video.